on the set, speed, and action.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at another unique flight sim, which definitely doesn't play like any other flight sims out there, that game being Stunt Island. Well, calling it a flight sim is kind of a misnomer, since that's only half the experience, with the other half being something which I don't believe had ever been attempted in a game prior. I don't even think it's been attempted since. Video editing. Yeah, Stunt Island is a game about flying aircraft to perform death-defying stunts, then editing the footage together from the various cameras which were rolling during the stunt to assemble short videos. This is, well, okay, I need to refer to Sid Meier's covert action rule again. It's better to make one good game than two great games. What we have here is an extremely competent flight simulator attached to an extremely competent linear video editing system. That each alone has been coded well and fits their purposes perfectly, but both components are so incredibly disparate from each other that it takes a certain kind of person to enjoy every aspect of this program. Fortunately, this game's developers were very aware of this, as many aspects of the program have options for enabling or disabling this interconnectivity, meaning you can utilize any aspect of this program you want to without having to utilize the other aspects. Or you can dive right off the deep end and just do it all. Granted, there is an actual gaming component to this thing, in the form of pre-built stunts to fly, and they range in difficulty from being easy to perform to borderline impossible. So if you're trying to approach this program as a proper game, it's going to frustrate you a bit, but thankfully, for the most part, the frustrations are a result of natural difficulty, which can be overcome with practice. There's a couple small exceptions, and I'll point them out as we go forward here, but they're not deal breakers, just things to be aware of. Stunt Island was developed by a British studio known as the Assembly Line, was published through Disney in 1992, and is best referred to simply as a one-player simulation game, since it's equal parts simulating stunt flying and video editing. There's nothing wrong with just calling it a straight-up flight sim either. It supports VGA 320x200, 256 color graphics, and a mix of common and uncommon sound devices, keeping in mind that the game supports using either digitized music or synthesized music. Thus, you only ever have to use the AdLib or MT32 support if you lack any of the digitized options. As for its current release state, it's still commercial but readily available on digital storefronts such as GOG and Steam, typically selling for $10 on either, but also frequently going on sale for only $2.50. So if you're not in a hurry to try this game out, then it's best to wait for a sale price since they happen very frequently. Now, if you want a physical copy instead, then they're actually fairly easy to come across and often found fully boxed by nature of the copy protection requiring the manual. However, the prices are just absolutely erratic. To drive the point home, as I'm writing this script, I have two eBay listings pulled up at the moment. One for loose discs at $15, and another fully boxed for $7. Seriously, the prices are just all over the map with this one. Though to be fair, most listings for the loose discs have just a single-digit price, and most listings fully boxed are between $25 and $40. Again, remembering that you need the manual to get past the copy protection. So if you're only buying loose discs, you'll need to be prepared to deal with that. Whenever you start up Stunt Island, the game always immediately asks you two very important questions. Are you going to be playing the competition mode, and are you going to be doing your own editing? The competition mode not only allows you to choose a different call sign for yourself, which the game will call out with voice clips at appropriate moments, but adds a scoreboard to the mix, which you're trying to advance through in terms of dollar earnings, with the amount you earn depending on how many takes you need to properly film each of the game's 32 built-in stunt sequences. Now, given how difficult some of the stunts are, I highly recommend not playing in the competition until you're relatively good at flying all of the game's built-in stunts. If you elect to do your own editing, the game will advance from completing a stunt to printing the film, and then taking you to the game's editing suite to assemble the footage into a full sequence to watch. And if you instead decide you don't want to do your own editing, the game will jump straight from a successful stunt flight to showing you a finished movie of what you just did, assembling it automatically using various rules set within the stunt sequence itself. And even if you decide not to do your own editing and opt for the automatic editing, there's nothing stopping you from going in and doing your own editing following, since everything's kept track of in separate files. Following the startup questions, you're now able to explore the island and go to its various facilities, including the ferry, housing, production, post-production, and the airfield. The ferry is where you go to quit the game or start a new run. Housing is primarily for the competition mode, where you go to look up standings and stunt success rates, while also going through messages left for you on your machine, which adds some flavor to the proceedings. Production is where you go to talk to the stunt coordinator to fly a stunt sequence, or access set design to put together your own stunt sequences, while the airfield lets you choose one of the game's 45 different aircraft and take it for a spin around the island to scout the place out on your own accord. Again, despite all of these different aspects being intertwined, you don't have to perform any of these things if you don't want to. As already mentioned, the game will automatically edit together videos of the stunts you fly if you want it to, but let's say you want to do the editing, but not the flying. Well, the game includes a number of pre-made flight sequences you can load up and then cut together yourself. The competitive aspect can be turned on and off at will, and then as for set design, the main purpose there is making your own stunt sequences, which can either be done from scratch if you're so inclined, or separate files are included which are copies of the built-in stunt sequences, so you can load one of those as a base and then work from there towards altering the sequences however you want. But I would say the meat of the game is doing the stunt flying, so let's talk about how that goes down. First, you go to the stunt coordinator and select which stunt sequence you want to perform. You're given a description telling you exactly what to do, then you immediately go into takes. Each sequence will start you in a pre-selected plane, either on a runway or already in the air, and the goal is to perform the stunt as instructed, with various failure conditions set depending on what the stunt is, such as taking too long, flying too high or too low, crashing into the wrong things. Though it is curious that because of the way the stunt sequences are laid out, sometimes you can get away with crashing into certain things without consequence. Regardless, if you succeed, you could then print the take and then go on to manually editing the video or viewing the auto-edited sequence. If you fail, you can either attempt another take or wrap things up. And there's a limit on how many takes you get before you're fired from the sequence, but this is only consequential in the competition mode, where you can only attempt each stunt sequence once. And if you're not playing in the competition, then there's not really any consequences for screwing up too many times. Now, let's talk about the flight model, because this is what flight simulators live or die by. Stunt Island has one of the most accurate flight models I've ever come across in the realm of DOS gaming, with the sole exception that it doesn't simulate wind. And it handles the rudder properly, it handles stalling properly, it handles lift properly, which, yes, I know you wouldn't think lift is a thing simulators would get wrong, but surprisingly many do. I mean, this is proper flight simulation mechanics through and through. But it's not perfect, and not because of the flight model, but because of the controls. The game has support for keyboard controls, mouse controls, and joystick controls, as well as support for joystick throttles, but not rudder pedals. You're even able to set a custom and precise dead zone when calibrating the joystick, and can watch an indicator as you do so to see how well you're dialing it in. Many aspects have been simplified as well, as the only things you have control over beyond standard avionics are gears, flaps, brakes, and weapons, as some planes are equipped with guns, missiles, or bombs for use in some of the stunts. However, there are some notable failings of these controls. The first is one that I'm not actually sure is a failing or not, but it comes into play on more than one occasion: oversteer. The manual specifically points out not to stay at full throttle if you don't need to, because the faster your plane is moving compared to how fast it's able to go, the more sensitive the controls will be, and thus the harder it will be to make precise movements. What's actually going on is that the faster you're going, the faster the controls will respond, but also the more inertia the controls will gain, meaning when you stop pressing the controls, it takes longer for that imparted motion to neutralize, thus leading to oversteer. I don't know if this is a thing that actually happens with real aircraft, but given that the supersonic aircraft in the game are near impossible to steer once they've passed the speed of sound, I'm guessing this either isn't actually a thing or simply hasn't been done quite right. Another notable failing, which I'm actually positive is a failing, is that you cannot control the ailerons and rudder at the same time. The ailerons are what allow you to roll the aircraft, and the rudder is what allows you to yaw to a minor degree. Now, even when you're using the keyboard to control the plane, there are no controls specific to the ailerons or rudder, instead giving you a button that you have to hold down to switch between controlling one or the other, with an option in the game's preferences to choose which is active by default and which is active when you hold the button down. Since a ton of precision is often necessary to fly these stunts, I frequently found myself wishing for at least some capacity to affect the rudder and ailerons at the same time, but nope, no such luck. Worse still, there's a couple problems with that button for switching between ailerons and rudders. The first is that if you press it down, it maintains the state of which control surface you were controlling instead of returning it to neutral. This means if you press it down mid-roll expecting to stop rolling, you don't stop rolling. The other issue is that if you're holding the button down, then fire a weapon of any kind, the game forgets that you're holding the button down and will suddenly start doing the opposite of what you expect to be doing. This makes it incredibly difficult to do certain kinds of maneuvers while also firing machine guns or such. Now, if you happen to crash during a stunt flight, you get treated to a hospital sequence, which,
You have a calcified gallstone, an ankle bone spur, a fractured clavicle, and bad breath. We'll have you patched up and flying again tomorrow.
Yeah, thankfully you can disable these hospital sequences too, but it is amusing that it throws a series of random medical conditions at you and then says you'll be good in just a day. This island basically has Star Trek tier medicine going on from the looks of things. There's a few other things to keep note of about the simulation model too, which aren't failings so much as just things to be aware of. For instance, the collision detection is incredibly accurate, but sometimes you're going to get into collisions without thinking you actually hit anything. The flat shaded polygons don't help with this for sure, and for a while I thought it was the field of view, but I've since measured it and the field of view is 70 degrees, which is fairly normal. So I think what's going on here, despite all of this, is that some objects have accurate collision properties and some don't. Though it seems to be a bigger problem with angled polygons compared to flat polygons. So it may simply be that collision volumes are only being checked as rectangular boxes or spheres. Another odd thing is that if you set your throttle to 0%, the engine sound disappears entirely. Doesn't matter what plane, happens on all of them. I'm pretty freaking sure you can still hear the engines on real planes when they're on, but idle. Needless to say, this might throw you off depending on what you're expecting to hear. The last thing to be aware of is that not every stunt sequence included is explained or processed properly. For instance, in this one here, I have to land on a blue building. Well, I tried the closer blue building first, but there was very much not enough time to come to a stop on top. And so then I figured it must be the blue building in the distance. But when I landed on it, the game didn't stop. So I loaded up the stunt in the set designer, and sure enough, it wanted me to land on the first blue building, which I figured was going to be impossible. But a very large number of tries later, I was able to pull it off. The trick being that you need to hit your stall speed with flaps down and touch down at the very edge of the roof pretty much simultaneously with the brakes already engaged. This wasn't hard to figure out, but the fact that there were two blue buildings, that's what kind of confused things there. Or here we have a sequence where I'm supposed to fly through a tunnel with an oncoming train going through in the opposite direction. The explanation of the stunt says to make sure you don't exit the tunnel before the train even gets there. So my thinking is, so long as I pass through the tunnel after the train has entered it, I'm okay. If I get to the tunnel too early, it explicitly fails me with a too early message. So once I get my speed right, I approach the tunnel, the train is passing through, and as I hit the tunnel, I again get a too early message. Curious. And I should point out, I am barely above the plane's stall speed at this point, so I figure out a way to delay my reaching the tunnel even more by climbing a little and coasting down to right above my stall speed, reach the tunnel as late as I possibly can, and I still get a too early failure. After a lot of trial and error, as well as looking through the configuration of the stunt in the set designer, I figured out what you're supposed to do. It's that you have to enter the tunnel at the exact same moment the train does. If the train is already leaving the tunnel, you're too late, but the game still gives you a too early message because of how it's been scripted. So I pushed my throttle up a little and eventually found the sweet spot, which got me through the tunnel at the exact same timing that the game wanted. And that's actually a lot of what the stunt flying comes down to here, is finding the right speeds or altitudes to do what you're supposed to do, given that timing is such a huge factor. And once you know what those speeds or altitudes are, it's good to write them down somewhere so that if you ever intend to play the game's competition mode, you have those important timing details on hand and can use them to help clear the stunts appropriately. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time with the set designer because it's incredibly involved if you want to make your own custom stunt sequences, but you can literally put together a full sequence the same as any of the built-in stunts. You even get scored by them. The way it all works is that you set up cameras to record the action, with the ability to attach cameras to literally any object. You set up your various objects, which will be in the scene, with a variety of locations around the island, which have scenery and buildings and such set up by default. And then you can also place special flat planes and spheres to act as triggers for the scripting system. The scripting system is basically a series of if-then statements, which can each be set up to only fire once or to be able to fire multiple times. The trick is that each if-then statement can only have up to 3 qualifiers, so you need to get creative with setting and checking flags if you need more complexity than that. Also keep in mind that the scripting system is how you set up automatic editing of the stunts into short movie clips without user input, as well as setting up failure conditions, as crashing the plane is not a failure condition by default. In fact, if you crash the plane and no failure state is set up for doing so, you can actually keep flying the plane. The last thing to mention is the video editing portion of the program. This very much acts like a typical linear video editor, with a series of tracks on one side which are synced together, and the assembled footage on the other side. You scrub through the footage to find a section you want from a specific camera, set the start and end points of the section you want to insert into your assembled video, then do so. You also have the ability to insert a handful of special effects into the assembled footage. What I find interesting though is the way this is even possible with early 90s hardware. I mean, let's do some math here. The game engine runs internally at 50 frames a second, with a typical cut film in this game running around a minute long, so about 3,000 frames, and screen resolution is 320 by 200 at 256 colors, which requires about 64 kilobytes of memory to show a single image. Uncompressed, this would be about 192 megabytes of video. Well beyond the system requirements of this game, well beyond the memory capacity of some hard drives of the time, to say nothing about the RAM. Not to mention, there's no compression artifact, and the game can instantaneously sync to any frame you want without delays. At face value, this is black magic and impossible. But this is also a game running a 3D engine. Yeah, this game is not saving image data at any point, just the presence of 3D objects and their matrix transformations, made simpler by the fact that the Stunt Island itself is mostly a fixed mesh, which doesn't need any special considerations. So, to put this in perspective instead, a typical stunt sequence in this game has around 20 custom objects present. Each object is using 32-bit integers to store translation and rotation data, each on 3 axes, so that's 24 bytes, and these positions need to be updated every frame for a moving object. So worst case scenario, all 20 objects are moving, and thus that would be 24 kilobytes a second, which would translate out to 1.44 megabytes for the full minute. That's a lot less than 192 megabytes, and fits within memory much more succinctly. Though given that the actual files storing all of this following a flight are much smaller, typically between 50 and 200 kilobytes, there's definitely some additional factors in play to simplify the data and make it even easier to parse out. The point is, the game isn't making a recording of the imagery of the flights, it's just making recordings of where everything is at every moment. For anyone who's done any modern 3D animation work, it's kind of similar to that. Quite frankly, combining this with a linear video editor was kind of an ingenious way of pulling it off, even if it was the only way of pulling it off with consumer-grade hardware at the time, all things considered. And just for fun, I did decide to do my own cut of one of the built-in stunt sequences. The stunt was to first capture a rogue hot air balloon carrying explosives by running into its basket with my plane, then I needed to fly it over to the castle, at which point it'll automatically release and begin floating up. Then finally, I have to shoot it down before it gets too high. Performing the stunt itself goes mostly okay, but it's a bit tight trying to turn around and train your guns on the balloon in time before it floats too high, given that you're not exactly in a high-performance fighter jet. Regardless, the reason I decided to do my own cut of this stunt is because I was very unsatisfied with how the auto-editing handles this one. In fact, let's compare the two. First, I'm going to show you how the game cut the footage together itself, bearing in mind that this stunt sequence has only a couple extra cameras set up, so it's hard to get good shots of anything. And now, using the exact same raw footage, here's my cut. Again, the camera options were severely limited in the stunt sequence, but I think it goes without saying which is the better cut. Overall, Stunt Island can be a surprisingly fun software toy, if you enjoy at least one of its three key aspects, either the flying itself, the video editing, or coming up with your own stunt sequences. But to say this is niche would be an understatement. The game was well received when it came out, but realistically, it's hard to know who the target audience really were, especially when you consider that most people find video editing to be more so work than fun, myself included. But there was a novelty factor as well. Nowadays, I'm going to guess a solid number of you watching this video have seen a nonlinear video editor interface or even a linear editor interface at some point in your lives. But scroll back to the early 90s and virtually no one would have come face to face with such a thing, as that kind of tech was limited exclusively to people in film and television production. Thus, seeing that here and being able to mess with it contributes a massive novelty factor for anyone who was playing this game back in the 90s. Nowadays, the stunt flying aspect itself is still fun, albeit a little frustrating when the controls get in the way or the stunt itself seems borderline impossible, but the editing aspect is old hat now, and not really going to appeal to anyone anymore as something that's fun. Basically, what I'm getting at is that the novelty of the editing component has long since expired, but there's still fun to be had here all the same from the flying. So I would primarily recommend this game to anyone who enjoys any kinds of flight simulators. But if that's not you, then the video editing aspect is not going to be enough to carry you through this thing. If you're not using a joystick with this game, then you simply need to set the cycles count to 20,000, and it should run perfectly fine. The auto and max settings were not working very well when I tried them, so I definitely recommend sticking with a fixed cycles count. Now, if you do want to use a joystick as well, then you're going to want to set the joystick type to CH flight stick mode, so that you can set up the hat with custom controls if you'd like, and so you can use the throttle. Plus, you'll want to turn off timed intervals, turn off button wrap if you intend to map buttons beyond the fourth keyboard keys, and you'll likely need to swap the third and fourth axes, since most modern joysticks with throttles assign the throttle to the fourth axis, not the third, as this game will expect. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on September 30th, will be an ADG Pro video, where we're going to be going back to an old dungeon crawl to investigate one of its underlying mechanics, to see how fairly balanced it is, and to try and determine what its maximum potentials are, and if it's even possible to hit all of its maximum potentials in a single run. So be sure to stay tuned to see how that plays out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.